Let me move on and introduce our guest. I'm delighted to be joined by a good friend and a good friend of popular conservatism, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, British politician and broadcaster who was the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset from 2010 to 2024, well-known Eurosceptic, one of the most rebellious Conservative MPs under David Cameron's premiership, campaigned for the UK to leave the European Union in the 2016 referendum. In 2019, a number of people, I think, encouraged him to throw his hat in the ring as a potential successor to Theresa May as Conservative Party leader, but he instead endorsed Boris Johnson, under whom he served as the leader of the House of Commons and Lord President of the Council and Minister of State for Brexit Opportunities and Government Efficiency. He supported Liz Truss in the 2022 leadership contest, was briefly Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in her short reign. Sadly, Jacob lost his seat earlier this summer, lost by some 5,000 votes. Reform UK, I think, polled about 7,000 votes in that constituency. So another example of a seat where perhaps the Reform UK candidate let in a Labour MP. And to bring us right up to speed and right up to date, in addition to Jacob being a star presenter on GB News, he's now even more of a star of the screen. Last night, I think, was when Discovery Plus put up Meet the Rees-Moggs. If you haven't seen it yet, get Discovery Plus and watch it. Angela and I sat down in before this interview to sort of get a glimpse of it. We binged watched episodes 1, 2 and 3. So I think I'm ahead of most of the population. I think we've still got a couple to go. But Jacob, welcome. Thanks very much for making the time to join us. How are you keeping?
Very well, and thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to do PopCon events, which I think are very well organised and represent a very important strand in Conservative thinking.
Well, that's great, and we'll definitely come to that, Jacob. Let's start with the fun stuff. Well, I mean, all of it's going to be fun, but the less political heavyweight stuff. Tell us a little bit. It's getting a lot of media attention about Meet the Moggs, which is a sort of fly-on-the-wall documentary starting sometime before the election, going past the election. We've gone past the election now and have joined you metaphorically on your holiday in France. It's great to watch. I've really enjoyed it, partly, of course, because, you know, I know you a little, which makes it even more intriguing. But why on earth did you agree to do it?
Well, it's a very good question. I've tended in life to say yes to more things than I've said no to, but by and large, you want to take opportunities when they come your way. I was very struck by how well Nigel did by going into the jungle and how important, actually, that turned out to be for Reform's prospects and success in the last election. And I definitely wouldn't go into the jungle. It just wouldn't be something I would be at all comfortable with. I thought inevitably it'd be more political rather than personal, because when I was talking about it initially, the election date hadn't been set. It seemed as if the Tories might get a little bounce. Reform hadn't really come to the fore at that point. So I thought it would be about what an MP does and so on, rather more than family life. And then once we got into it, I discovered it was great fun to do. We worked with very nice people, and it's been surprisingly jolly.
And it's made a television star out of your wonderful wife, hasn't it?
It has indeed, yes. I mean, Helen's been a huge success in this, which I'm not sure she was anticipating. I think her initial plan was to hide away as much as possible, but didn't work like that.
They've used every second of footage they could possibly get of her, it seems, perhaps. So how in general is, I mean, I appreciate much of this was, you know, a good chunk of this was filmed before the general election, but how's life after Parliament treating you? I mean, you mentioned in the show and you've mentioned in numerous interviews that you miss it. You're obviously still heavily involved in politics, but what's it been like after 14 years of being an MP, having whatever it is now, best part of 5 months of not being one?
Well, yeah, the key thing is the Conservatives are now in opposition. And I was in Parliament 14 years when the Conservatives were in government. And being in government is much better than being in opposition. I feel rather lucky, actually, because I've got various platforms, particularly my GB News platform, where I can discuss issues night after night. which is probably a better platform than being a backbench MP in opposition. So I found it hasn't really stopped me putting forward the things that I believe in and am concerned about. And that ties in a bit with the Discovery Plus, because if you want to maintain a platform as a politician, people have to know who you are. And for people to know who you are, you probably have to take an element of risk in the way you get people to know about you.
And John Hincey actually asks, I mean, you mentioned you've got actually, I think the word privilege is well over. I was going to say the privilege of a GB News platform, but it's not a privilege. It might be an honour. You've earned it. But privilege is a well overused word. But John Hincey asks, for those former Tory MPs who are perhaps thinking of running again next time, what kind of projects or jobs are they pursuing? Are you aware? I mean, because obviously you weren't the only Conservative to lose your seat. Two-thirds of Tory seats were lost. So more Conservatives MPs lost their seats than retained them overall. How much are you keeping in touch with others who didn't quite make it over the finish line on July the 4th?
Well, quite a few are coming on my programme, and so I see them. I had Michael Ellis on last night and Tom Pursglove. So there's a regular stream of former Tory MPs who are keeping involved and keeping up a public presence. My old friend Jeremy Quinn has gone off to do the Defence Review, which is terrific because he's very experienced in that area. So people are keeping in the field of public service, and I think they're deciding whether or not they want to stand again. That some will, some won't. Some people take defeat very personally. Some recognise that it's just the way the tide was going and that there's very little you can do about it. Some people were thinking of retiring, but felt that they should try and defend their seat. As an incumbent, they might have a better chance, and therefore will now be retiring. Somebody like Peter Bottomley isn't obviously going to stand again. So there's a mix of people's decisions.
Okay. Well, let's move on a bit to the sort of harder politics. So let's start by looking backwards and trying to do a quick sort of audit of the Conservatives' 14 years in office. I think sort of by the end, and again, your Discovery Plus documentary rather brings this out, it was obvious that the Conservatives were heading for a defeat, and fairly obvious that we were heading for a catastrophic defeat. But if you were to look back at that period of office, how much do you think there's to be proud about? How much do you think there's to be disappointed about? How much could and should have been done differently? Because the basic PopCon analysis is, I suppose, that we don't appear to have left the country in a more conservative state than we found it. And after 14 years in office, in aggregate, in the round, that's not to say there were no successes, that's a bit of a disappointing near decade and a half.
Well, first of all, we weren't in power for a near decade and a half. The first 5 years were a coalition, and the next 4 years after that were effectively minority rule. So it's only really the last 4.5 years that we have a comfortable overall majority. The most conservative thing we did in spite of, rather than because of, the Conservative Party. And you mentioned it in your introduction to me. I campaigned for Brexit, but David Cameron, Prime Minister at the time, was bitterly opposed to it. And unfortunately, about 2/3 of the parliamentary party were opposed to it, which meant that once it happened, you didn't have a Conservative Party that really knew what to do with Brexit or was divided on doing it. But Brexit was a very Conservative thing to do. It was a restorative thing. You know the old complaint of Evelyn Waugh. He said that people said, if you vote Tory, you're turning the clock back. And his whole life, they hadn't turned the clock back 10 minutes. Well, we did. We turned the clock back to 1972. Mm-hmm. And that begins a process of restoration. Do I think we could have been bolder? Absolutely. Were there individual successes? Yes. I think Gove's education reforms were fundamentally important. IDS's welfare reforms, fundamentally important. More to be done in both areas, but there were some successes. But we definitely didn't use Boris's 80-seat majority to maximum advantage, partly because of COVID, which knocked out 2 years of the 4.5, and partly, I think, because a lot of Tory MPs resented Brexit, never really bought into it, and therefore were determined to trip Boris up at any opportunity, and made the fateful mistake of getting rid of him just as we were beginning to do things. And just at the point at which he went, we were doing some really exciting things. We were going to slash the civil service. We were getting the retained EU law bill so that we would get rid of all EU law bills rather than the very watered down version that came through in the end. And that was a very unsatisfactory situation for the Tories.
Yeah. Notwithstanding those sort of pleas in mitigation, such as the coalition and then the majority disappearing, there needing a big confidence and supply sort of relationship with the Democratic Unionists, would you still sort of say though that if somebody just took a snapshot in 2010 of the prevailing fundamentals of British society and the British economy, let's say, for example, the prevailing tax rate, the size of the state, both in terms of spending and insofar as you can measure it in terms of regulation, all of that seems to, even though there might be reasons for it, the pandemic, is that all of that seemed to actually have a sort of drift in the wrong direction, as if socialism was slowly happening under a Conservative-led government rather than more rapidly happening under the present government. And you'd expect, wouldn't you, after a period of office, especially from such a high rate, that the overall burden of tax should perhaps be a bit lower after the Conservatives been in office as a proportion of GDP. The total quantum of government spending perhaps higher in cash terms, but perhaps lower again as a proportion of GDP, that you could point to some sectors that have been deregulated rather than re-regulated. I'm struggling to find too many of these other than those, the welfare reforms and the education reforms that you pointed out.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is true. And bear in mind that the first few years in the coalition, people were talking about being progressive. Well, being a progressive Conservative is a contradiction, that we're there to conserve. And this progressiveness meant that the top tax rate was never reduced from 50p back down to 40. It went halfway. That we started doing lunatic things about non-doms, which were much more aggressive than Gordon Brown had ever done. That the George Osborne approach to the Treasury was essentially to do the sort of things that Gordon Brown had done, a lot of sort of fiddling and tweaking and assuming that everybody was avoiding taxation and trying to get round the rules, rather than the Nigel Lawson approach of simplifying and lowering. In terms of regulation, this is where post-Brexit and not doing the retained EU law bill was such a mistake, because we've simply adopted EU regulations as our own laws rather than scrapping them. And so people are just as regulated now as they felt they were in 2016. And that's a huge missed opportunity. So I don't particularly disagree with your analysis. I just think there are some things that we have done that have been beneficial.
Rosalind Danks asks, because you'd mentioned the sort of defenestration of Boris Johnson, perhaps just at the point at which we were getting away from the pandemic and could focus on some domestic policy reforms. But then to move immediately after Boris, Rosalind asks, what's your view of what truly went wrong with Liz Truss's very short tenure as Prime Minister? You backed her, and why? I guess you might put those questions the other way around. You backed her, she won, she became Prime Minister. But a mere 49 days before another Conservative MP exits. What's your take on that short but bizarre and I would suggest quite important period in recent British politics?
What went wrong? I think the effort was to do too much too quickly. The Bank of England made a fateful decision to failed to raise interest rates as much as the Federal Reserve. So the Bank of England's own analysis, I think, says that 70% of the bond market problem that followed Kwasi's budget was its fault rather than Kwasi's fault, leaving only 30%. But when I said this at the time, everybody thought I was being ridiculous and just trying to put spin on what was happening. I think the culpability of the Bank of England is very significant, and a new Conservative government needs to look at whether Bank of England independence is actually a very good idea. I think the speed and a lack of political finesse, that I was all in favour of cutting the 45p rate to 40p, but it shouldn't have been in the first budget, or if it was, it shouldn't have been U-turned on. I think the U-turns were a significant problem, and there was a degree of disorganization that the point at which I knew it was all over was the vote on fracking, which I was strongly in favour of. We won by a majority of nearly 100. Very few Conservatives rebelled. But at the last minute, there was confusion over whether it was a vote of confidence or not. And this just smacked of inefficiency, lack of grip. And so it all came together. And then all the budget moves were changed, which was inevitably a mistake. If you give up on your overall policy, then you end up having to go.
It's fascinating what you say about the Bank of England. And again, Jacob, as you will know, the sort of popcorn proposition is problems of this type, I think we can find in many areas of British public policy, that we appear to have seen grow up a bunch of institutions policed by people, however well-intentioned, who are beyond, it appears, reasonable levels of accountability. So Truss and Kwarteng go as their mini budget blows up and their government collapses. Andrew Bailey missing the inflation target for, I don't know, what is it, 100 months in a row or something it felt like, or then the Bank of England admitting about 2/3 of the market blow up from the mini budget being down to them. Well, no suggestion he should resign. The Office for Budget Responsibility, when its targets are out by, what is it? Their forecasts rather are out by an average of 30 billion. No real suggestion they should resign. I think you make a case that the Climate Change Committee has more power than the Environment or the Energy Secretary, but very, very limited scrutiny. Same goes for the Civil Service. Do you think we've sort of inch by inch walked into a scenario in which, MPs and government ministers aren't really pulling levers, they're pushing string, and large swathes of the country are run by this quangocracy, what Donald Trump might call the deep state, although I find that a slightly conspiratorial view, but nevertheless, a bureaucracy that seems to be, out of the reach of normal democratic protocols?
Well, I think what has happened is that the systems were set up to plug in to the European Union. So independent central banks is a requirement of the Maastricht Treaty. And therefore that happened. The Environment Agency, Natural England, were all there to implement EU-level rules. We then left the EU without abolishing these bodies, and so they exist without linking in to the bit that has some scrutiny of them. And for all the faults of the European Union, the Commission did lay the framework for how these bodies ought to organise and did report to the Council of Ministers and to some extent the European Parliament, whereas we've just left these bodies with extraordinary independence. They need to be abolished. It's not just a question of changing their powers. They need to go, and these decisions need to go back to accountable ministers, which is where they always used to be prior to our membership of the European Union. And they made sense, they made intellectual sense within the context of the European Union, because they were implementing EU rules which weren't decided on Parliament, weren't decided on ministers, and ministers were there spending a lot of time going to Europe doing things that way rather than doing it in a parliamentary way. That was cut off, but the bodies remained. And that's why I think a new Conservative government has to think through very carefully how it reforms and abolishes the quangos, and should be pretty ruthless about abolishing as many as possible.
So we've sort of got rid of the socket, but have kept the plug.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Yes.
Okay, now let's sort of roll forward to what happens on July the 4th, the scale of the Conservative defeat. I mean, it shows how woeful expectations were. That certainly in the cluster of Conservatives I was watching the exit poll with, but I gather that this was true around much of the country of those on our side of the ledger. There was almost a sigh of relief that we were going to get as many as 120 or so seats. So low had expectations fallen. So, and indeed, some opinion polls suggested that, on the margins, we might not even have formed the official opposition. Do you think this defeat is an absolute game changer, something existential, that the Conservative Party is actually just sort of melting away? Or is this part of the rough and tumble of politics? Sometimes disastrous defeats happen. You need to pick yourself up, brush yourself down, keep calm and carry on. Or is there actually good reason not to keep very calm here? That something is changing in politics that is much more fundamental than, the people fell out of love with us a bit in the summer of 2024.
Well, I'd always keep calm, because I think if you don't keep calm, you won't be able to make a sensible analysis of what the problem is. But this defeat is different from 1997, and it's different from 1906, in that there is a party to our right. And that is a new challenge for the Conservatives. Previously, we fell out of fashion in broadly a two-party system. It was the left that had the problems about which party carried the flag for the left, whether it was the Liberals or the Labour Party. This is now happening to us, and is it the Conservatives or Reform? We went down to such a level that people who want to get rid of Labour and give Labour a kicking don't necessarily know whether to go to Reform or to the Conservatives. And that is a serious problem, and a different level of problem from one we've faced in our history. The scale of the defeat, and you're quite right, people thought we might not be the official opposition, is our own fault. It's our own fault for failures of policy, particularly failures on immigration, but also tactical failures. Having the election when we did was ridiculous. That it allowed Nigel Farage to do very well, which, had it been in November, he might have been in the United States with other interests. It happened before interest rates began to fall, making people feel a little bit better off. It happened before any Rwanda flight had had a chance to take off. Even if that ended up another row with the courts, at least it would have shown a sense of purpose. So we really did everything we could to maximize the damage. And then we have somebody on the right snapping at our heels. So I think it is a deep problem. And the deepest problem is that there's no point in listening at the moment to anything we say, because why should anybody trust us? And we've got to rebuild trust before what we say matters.
And how do you think you go about doing that? Is it actually a sort of, I can't remember who coined the term, a period of silence would be welcome? Does the Conservative leadership almost need to accept that it won't get a hearing? There's no point in saying anything on a loud hailer. Just to remind people, put your questions in the box and vote them up. I can see the one that's at the top out here. It touches on this issue from Mark Peacock. Jacob, it's been fascinating to observe the growing popularity of Reform UK at local level, with increasing membership translating into a significant activist base. This appears to pose a real challenge for the Conservative Party. At the same time, David Starkey's ideas, such as his vision for a Great Repeal Act, seem to go beyond mere academic thought and are resonating with a broader movement. In contrast, I wonder if figures like Kemi Badenoch, while talented, lack the instinct or urgency to navigate this fast-paced historical moment effectively. How do you think the Conservative Party can address these shifts? And do you see a clear path forward for the leadership in this context? So I guess, is there a danger with sort of hunkering down and waiting for a time at which the electorate might listen to us again? Or do we need to come up with something eye-catching, radical, transformative, and quick before Reform UK eat our breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
I was thinking of the hot air balloon analogy, which for a politician who talks a lot for his living may not be the best one, but I provide quite a lot of it. But we need to throw the sandbags overboard. And what do I mean by the sandbags? I mean the things we were committed to in government that weren't particularly conservative and didn't actually work. So we must drop net zero. We really, really have to. Net zero is destroying our economy, is shutting businesses, our car industry, our steel industry is basically gone. We still are very mealy-mouthed about that. We're sort of, well, we might delay the targets a bit, we might do this, we might, but no, net zero has to go. It's a really bad idea, and it makes no difference to the world anyway. We've got to take a view on immigration that means we pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights and we just deport people so they know that they will leave once they get here, and that people who come here illegally must go. We need essentially to shut the borders to mass migration legally. And if that means a few second-rate universities go out of business, I don't really care. that the economics of universities on providing not necessarily very good degrees for people coming over from abroad is not a sensible business model. If they want to do that, they can set up, as some private schools have done, branches overseas and actually educate people overseas. And we won't get migration down to the tens of thousands until we make some parts of industry complain. But industry has to complain, because you'll have seen the reduction in the productivity figures that are even worse than we thought because of mass migration, because some businesses have been relying on cheap labor rather than investing in productivity, improving machinery or processes. And so net zero, immigration, we must deal with straight away. I completely agree with Starkey's view of a restoration. We need to remove the constitutional changes made by Blair, which were all made in relation to us being part of a European superstate and joining in with an entirely different constitutional system. The UK does not have a separation of powers. It is not how the constitution was structured. Our constitution was the king in parliament, and every part of the constitution, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, was in parliament up until 1997, when it started being hacked about. And so Starkey's right, it's like 1660. We bring things back and restore them to how they were. And regrettably, the only constitutional restoration we did in our 14 years was of reversing something we had done. So we got rid of the ridiculous Fixed Term Parliament Act. But that's really important for those of you who are interested in the niceties of legislation. When the Fixed Term Parliament Act went through, I was told authoritatively that it could never be repealed because you cannot restore the prerogative. Once it's gone, it's gone. Now, when we came to repeal it, we discussed this, obviously, and came to the conclusion that you could put in legislation a line saying that the prerogative is restored to as it was before the bill was dealt with. And that has been held to be constitutionally valid. And so Parliament is now dissolved on the same basis it was before the Fixed Term Parliament Act. And if you can do that for that, you can do it for all the other things that were vandalised. You can bring back the Lord Chancellor, you can get rid of the Supreme Court and put it back into the House of Lords, which is fundamental, actually. We should not have a Supreme Court in this country because the Supreme Court is Parliament. And that's always been the whole point of Parliament, to correct the law. You may remember when we had this ridiculous row over Rwanda, when Parliament disagreed with the Supreme Court, and everybody said Parliament can't decide facts. But yes, of course it can. The judgment of Parliament in legislation is not only just as valid, it is more valid than the judgment of judges. It's all about judgment.
This is fascinating then. So again, to go back to the Conservative Party as a movement for this, let me put forward the pessimistic case that you'd sort of said, well, we've been lily-livered on carbon net zero. Might there be a worry that on the big issues that we now face in the 2020s, the Conservatives can't really make their mind up, that Nigel Farage is right? Half of the Conservatives should join the Liberal Democrats and the other half should join Reform, because whether it's on our membership of the EU, whether it's on remaining as a signatory of ECHR, whether it's on whether carbon net zero is the most important target for mankind or is ruining our economy, there's a plethora of views. There doesn't seem to be a unified Conservative Party instinct here. So we're getting outflanked by Reform. They no doubt have divisions amongst them, but it just would instinctively be for Brexit, against the ECHR, sceptical about carbon net zero. It's some sort of winnowing out of the Conservative Party such that it's what's left of it at least knows where it stands on these major issues, rather than my criticism of Theresa May was whenever you asked her a binary question, her answer was 0.5. Is that now a problem for the Conservative Party as it exists today? 0.5 is our answer to every binary question.
Well, my telephone is propped up against the multi-volume biography of Disraeli by Moneypenny and Buckle. And I think we ought to go back to Disraeli and understanding what Conservatives want to do. And Disraeli was very clear that we believed essentially in the Constitution, an almost mythical belief in the Constitution, but an island myth is not a bad thing to have as an understanding of your nation and your loyalty to it, and the condition of the people. Now, if you believe in our historic Constitution, then you get rid of the ECHR and you restore the law lords and you recognize that the legitimate decision maker is the nation state. So you pull out of the International Criminal Court and all these ridiculous bodies that claim to overrule the nation state because there is no validity beyond the nation state. And international law is not real. That is to say, there is no parliament that can change it. The judiciary are not appointed to the same standards as British judges. It's essentially politics and diplomacy under another name, under actually a left-wing guise of internationalism, and internationalism very much a founding thought of the Labour Party. So you get the constitutional bit as a fundamental Conservative principle, and the condition of the people. We have, for the first time in history, a government that is seeking to make energy more expensive. And energy, cheap energy, is fundamental to the condition of the people. It is the great source of economic development and of comfort. And so if we go back to Disraelian principles, and might even say, if we're to be one nation conservatives, the term never actually used by Disraeli, as everybody on this call will know, he refers to the two nations, the rich and the poor, but one nationism comes in the 20s or 30s, whenever it does. If we go back to that, then people who claim to be conservatives have to believe in certain things. And those who think that it is more important for us to live in caves and not have any electricity, or to have very expensive electricity, aren't really conservatives. Those of us who don't believe in our constitution and think we should have a foreign one aren't really conservatives, and they would be much better off in another party, or accepting where conservatism is. Now, Nigel's point, half should go off to the Lib Dems and half to Reform. Actually, Reform should reintegrate with the Conservative Party, because that's where most Reform voters, members, and indeed politicians come from. And if they came back, that would anchor the Conservative Party in the right place, in my view.
Stephen McLean says, quoting Disraeli, "I am a Conservative to preserve all that is good in our Constitution and a radical to remove all that is bad." He attributes that to Disraeli. Bruce Goodwin asks, in terms of a reset, have we lost some of the ability? You've touched on this, Jacob, saying the Fixed Parliament Act shows not necessarily that its simplicity itself, but Bruce asks, have we lost the ability to restore the Lord Chancellor? Is it a bit like putting a vacuum-packed mattress back in its box? It's simply not feasible. What are the key things, he asked, you would focus on with regard to this restoration or repeal act? And if this is to be the first act of the next Conservative government, which, given how the present government's doing, could be as early as 2029, do you think this is the first thing that should be put forward to Parliament? Here's all the stuff we're going to get rid of. And if so, do you think this chimes at all with the British electorate, who, don't really care about the Fixed Term Parliament Act, or whether it's the Supreme Court or the law lords, or what fancy outfit the Lord Chancellor wears, or whether the Bank of England is, should be more accountable to Parliament? They're worried about their wages, their energy costs, and the rest of it. How does one make what, however important it might be, what feels like a rather nebulous, abstract constitutional sort of analysis of the problems afflicting the United Kingdom into something that might lead the good voters of North East Somerset to reverse the decision they made on July the 4th and re-elect you or somebody like you?
Well, you're absolutely right that not many people get excited about constitutional reform, but they do get interested in the fact that ministers can't, in fact, make decisions. And every decision a minister makes to deport somebody gets overturned by the court. And we cannot govern unless we change the mechanics of government. So There's been a lot of criticism of the civil service. My experience of the civil service was not that they were left-wing and not that they were trying to stop everything I wanted to do, but they would come to me and say, Minister, you can't do that. And why can't you do it? You can't do it under the Climate Change Act. You can't do it under the Equality Act. You can't do it because of an animal of some kind that is protected under some heritage piece of EU legislation. And my feeling about that is that's because we allowed those laws to stay in place. And until you have the constitutional reform and the Great Repeal, and you get rid of the Equality Act, and you get rid of the Climate Change Act, and you get rid of the Constitutional Reform Act, and you get back to where we ought to be, we can't actually govern. So inevitably you end up with soft left government because all the decisions are being made along railway tracks laid down by Tony Blair. And those railway tracks go to the left, not to the right. So absolutely, I don't expect people to be putting up posters saying, let's restore the pre-1997 constitution. What I expect instead is for this to be the means to the end of governing and ensuring that if the government wants to build a road, we can build it for a cost that is comparable to competitor nations, rather than being the most expensive road building anywhere in the world, not just by a little, but by a multiple of other nations' costs. It's having a terrible downbeat effect on our economic performance.
That's interesting what you say about the civil service, that it's more the legislative institutional backdrop rather than the personnel as such. I won't name them, but a senior cabinet minister in the previous government suggested that actually the approach of the personnel, he described it as, was consent to the minister, but then evade, consent, but evade. That he might want something done, and they say, oh, yes, it sounds like a terribly good idea. We'll look into it and get back to you by Friday. Sort of nothing comes back by Friday. And then there were 100 million legal reasons or cross-departmental reasons, or, well, we'd actually agreed this with Japan over a 5-year period. We can't unravel it, whatever it might be. So I guess the question I want to put to you is, do you think the civil service are neutral, or do you think we should actually bite the bullet and say at the top level, the cabinet secretary, the director generals, perhaps down to director level, we should take a leaf out of the sort of American book? These should be political appointments. We shouldn't have this sort of weird thing of special advisors who do the political appointees, do the comms and the politics side of it, and then the civil service who are supposedly these completely neutral people. Why don't they just live or die with the politics of the administration at the higher level, not Jim working in accounts, but the people who are actually working on policy?
I think a determined minister can get through the policies that he or she wants to get through. But you get a lot of ministers who end up becoming the spokesman for their department rather than for the government as a whole. And I mean, that's very much the yes minister mode. And I saw this in cabinet subcommittees, that ministers would come along. I'd be sent along to defend my departmental interest, which I then didn't do because I thought this was nonsense. And I looked at the government as a whole and I thought that was interesting. That's why I say a minister who wants to do his bit can. I have come to the conclusion that we need to change because of Sue Gray. I feel that having somebody who did a fundamental report into the Prime Minister that led to his downfall, who then turned out to be about to join the Labour Party as a chief of staff, was outrageous, and partly because I thought highly of Sue Gray as a civil servant. She was a very competent person. That she behaved like that was deeply unsatisfactory. And let's not forget Patrick Vallance, who locked us up all the time. Classic socialist, wanted to have control of all our lives, told us that if we didn't do what he said, we'd all die, and then turns out to be a socialist minister. I mean, I think that's dreadful, absolutely appalling that he should be in that position, and that we listened to him thinking he was independent. We should have noticed he always wore one of those rainbow lanyards, and that is always a sign of left-wingery.
So you say that I just want to labour this point a bit more. Martin Bristow asks, I wonder how far Jacob would endorse Liz Truss's critique that the whole of the civil service wider bureaucracy is preventing the implementation of Conservative policies. You have touched on that. But I just want to pick you up a bit. And actually, a former Labour minister who I was on GB News with a while back, Bill Rammell, made, I think, almost exactly the same comment that you made, which was a determined minister can get it through. But my sort of point is, why should our ministers have to be particularly determined? You've got to have this sort of genius of navigating your way around the bureaucracy, play some sort of incredibly clever game of charm and diplomacy and threat in order to get your policy. I don't want the ministers to have to be particularly determined. I want their word to be treated as law by the bureaucracy.
But because I'm being tactful about ministers. Well, what I mean is a minister who actually does the job of being a minister and makes decisions. An awful lot of ministers are quite happy to take the official advice and just go along with it. It's a very good way to get your next job. You don't make a mistake. Whereas if you're a minister who likes making decisions, inevitably you will make mistakes. And then you're less likely to get the next promotion at the next reshuffle. But there are ministers who've made very good careers over just being the form signer for the civil servants.
Failing upwards.
Yes, that's right. And because there was no blot on their copybook, they got the next promotion when a safe pair of hands was needed. You know all the stuff. I mean, when Rishi Sunak decided we would raise taxes, how many people in the cabinet spoke out against that? Well, Liz did, Kwasi did, Kit Malthouse did, and I did. And I think that was it.
So let's move on. How do we piece this together? You've touched on it a bit, and you've been on the record actually about our future relationship with reform. It may be a bit early days now. We've almost certainly given Labour's majority, barring some cataclysm. We've probably got 4 years or so until the next election. But if you were to look at a recent opinion poll, and it's not a complete outlier, it's a slight outlier, but not a total outlier. But the Conservatives on 27% of the vote, Labour on 25%, and Reform on 22%. And you can see both the opportunity and the problem here. I think if that was mapped onto a uniform national swing, Labour might actually be able to cling on to office with 25% of the vote. But on the flip side, you could also see that if somehow or other you could bring together at least most of that 27% Conservative bloc and most of that 22% Reform bloc, you're on for a centre-right landslide, at least on the present, snap polls. How do you think practically, and when should we begin to try and bring the Conservative family back together? What's it take? Is it more and more people like you simply calling for it, or is it a slow, gentle romance that eventually leads to marriage? What should happen if these sort of numbers prevail? I appreciate on the one side of the ledger, if you like, the devoutly loyalist Conservative Party members might say, well, we can put Reform to bed, we'll get them back down to 5% of the vote and then it doesn't really matter. On the Reform side of the ledger, there's a view we can sort of knock out the Conservative Party, and if we overtake them in the polls, supposing this sort of stalemate persists, where the Conservatives are ahead of Reform, but Reform has a substantial block of the vote such that you can't really pilot away to the right of centre winning a general election. What should actually be done in the weeks, months and years ahead?
Well, as you rightly say, it's early days, and I think people aren't ready for that. I don't think Nigel wants to do that at the moment. I think Nigel thinks that he can take over, which I think is extremely unlikely. And there are Conservatives who think that Reform will just gently fade away, which normally happens after a general election. That Reform is remaining as high in the polls as it has is a very important sign of its success, and that it's not tainted by having been in office, because lots of people still don't want to come back to the Tories because they feel we let them down, particularly on things like immigration. I think people with local elections will want to be thinking in the way that Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens think at local elections. They don't have formal pacts, but in this ward, the Greens campaign hardest, in this ward, the Lib Dems, in this ward, Labour. They may not even put candidates up in every single ward, and they therefore work out what is going to work best for their wing of politics. And I wonder whether local deals of that kind might not be of interest to people. See if they work, see if we can run the odd council together effectively, see if personal partnerships can be made. See if we can help reform, because reform has a lot of oddballs in it still, as we saw at the last election, candidates who Nigel himself had to disown. And that is a problem for a new party, that it's very difficult to vet all the people who end up carrying your flag. Whereas the Conservative Party has been vetting people now for decades, and they're, it's much easier when you've had that structure for a long time.
Okay. And so, I mean, I'm not trying to get completely ahead of ourselves here, and it would be fair for you to say it's a wholly hypothetical question. But if that sort of arrangement were to prevail, I'll segue into Enrico Nathaniel's question here. Such a pleasure to be with you in the webinar, Jacob. My question is: do you think a government coalition between Conservative and Reform UK could be a good idea? Were that sort of practice at local level to prevail, one could imagine, plucking numbers out of thin air, that at the next general election, I don't know, there are 260 Conservatives returned and 100 Reform MPs returned. The inexorable logic would be to form a coalition government between those two parties, if that was the maths, right?
Yeah, of course it would, yes. Much more satisfactory than doing deal with the Lib Dems. And the UK is very, very lucky in Nigel Farage, because he is fundamentally civilized. If you look at some of the right-wing parties across continental Europe, they have figures that nobody will go into partnership with because they are so extreme. And Nigel isn't in that category. He is a normal political figure within the broad range of political figures in this country. And that's a great safeguard for us, and a good fortune, actually.
Well, we spent most of this webinar, Jacob, sort of reflecting on, how the Conservatives build back from here. John Wright there asks a question. Perhaps we should at least touch on what we think of the Labour government after its first, what is it now, nearly 5 months in office. John Wright asks, do you think the key issues of today, Labour's poor performance, the economy and immigration, will be the same or similar at the time of the next election? What's your general audit on Labour's performance to date? I try to be as objective as I can. I have to say, I thought that they would do all of the wrong things, but I thought they would probably do those wrong things fairly competently. And I've been rather amazed at how quickly the administration seems to have unravelled. They haven't communicated their policies well. Even if they had, I wouldn't agree with them. But they seem to have set bear traps for themselves and walked into it. The winter fuel allowance, you might have an argument that, we should wrap that into the pension, but that came out of a clear blue sky, saves 1.5 billion. The farmers' tax, again, you might argue that inheritance tax should be sort of level, but they haven't put that argument very well. That's only £500 million saved. They've had problems with Louise Hay's mobile phone, Rachel Reeves' CV, who pays for Keir Starmer's spectacles and his wife's dresses. What did you expect it to be this bad this quickly?
No. I thought that they would be what Keir Starmer has always seemed to me to be, rather dull, but not bad, not wildly incompetent. I thought they would look at little things. You see, there was a feeling before the election that nothing in Britain was working. You couldn't get an appointment with your GP, you couldn't get a driving license from DVLA, you couldn't get through to HMRC on the telephone. I thought by sort of little tweaks, they could improve bits and pieces there. They'd make sure that HMRC answered the telephone, just create a feeling that the grown-ups were in charge, which was what they were saying was happening. And they've done the absolute reverse. As I said, it's not what I expected. It is completely extraordinary how badly and quickly it has unravelled. And the pay rise for the train drivers at the same point, which they've now told us cost £135 million, at the same point as you're taking away money from pensioners. Absolutely classic. You give money to the union that is one of the founding unions of the Labour Party. It was the railwaymen and the miners who really got Labour going. And you take money away from Conservative voting pensioners. It was straightforward, partisan, reward our supporters, hit those who haven't supported us. Then the Frockgate, how badly they responded to it. Remember that the left believe themselves to be so worthy that they cannot do anything that is actually wrong. So when you say to them, look, this looks a bit crooked, they say, well, oh, it can't be. I'm such a good and pious person. They don't understand the bad image that they've created. And Starmer's greed, £110,000 worth of freebies, in being more than double the next highest receiver of freebies, who is also a Labour member of Parliament, member of the Cabinet. I think it's Lucy Powell comes in second, but in the £40,000 range. Just extraordinary. And then you have a reset. Look, we all know, everyone on this call knows, that when you have a reset, first of all, you try not to call it a reset, and that's exactly what they're doing. You blame your communications. Communications haven't been good enough. Every time a government's in trouble, it blames its communications. It's not that our policies are wrong. It's not that we're morons. It's that our communications aren't very good. They are going through the playbook of failed governments, but instead of doing it after 3 years, they're doing it after 5 months. And I don't think this is recoverable. And a lot of commentators are saying there's a long time to go and all of that. But if you think back to when Margaret Thatcher was very low in the opinion polls, she was low in the opinion polls not because people thought she was useless, but she was doing things that were controversial and were unpopular whilst they were being implemented. This is a view that has built up that Starmer just isn't competent. And that's a very hard view to change, and that Rachel Reeves is a little bit dodgy. And wanting to boast about being an economist, a dismal scientist, seems to me to be an interesting thing to boast about. But nonetheless, she wanted to pretend she was an economist rather than the complaints manager for a bank. And that just makes her, well, she plagiarized her book as well. This is part of a pattern. It is not somebody who's just made a minor mistake. Louise Haigh is very odd in terms of her resignation. I cannot get an answer to the question, why was it all right for her to be in government, having committed a criminal offence, when only Keir Starmer knew about it? But when everybody else knew about it, she had to go. I don't think that makes any sense at all. And I think the view that she didn't tell Pet is absolutely bogus, that if the Prime Minister knows, that's senior to Pet. Pet is an administrative function. The Prime Minister said, the fact I have a fraudster in my cabinet's fine. And a fraudster age 24, I mean, you know, a spent conviction, not an unreasonable view to have come to. But when it's known having a fraudster in my cabinet is impossible. I haven't seen any answer to that.
I wonder also if a difference with the Thatcher administrations, where there was often a long period of unpopularity followed by then tremendous electoral success when polling day came around, is that you could argue that the sort of sensible way of going about things is to apply the painful surgery, expect that the electorate won't much like the taste of the medicine, and it will be unpleasant and painful, but you then reap the benefits of the patient getting healthier and the rehabilitation. And actually, after the surgery and the medicine, which is an unpleasant thing to go through, actually a couple of years later, you're feeling a lot better and you thank the surgeon or the politician in this case. It's very hard for me to work out I mean, I know I would ideologically disagree with them, but I can't work out what Labour think the surgery is that they're conducting. Why this would lead to, I don't know, enhanced economic growth or higher salaries or increasing productivity, which, as you pointed out, now appears to be falling. So is that really their problem? There just isn't a sort of game plan here. It's not obvious to me. I think Keir Starmer later this week is going to set out his milestones for success against his missions, but they seem completely make no sense to me at all about why there will be a harvest that will be reaped, for which the British electorate will then be enormously grateful 3 or 4 years hence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is essentially a hard left government that is following socialist nostrums. That, I think, is where it's going. But we all know that that leads to economic failure, that it did with Attlee, it did with Wilson, it did with Wilson-Callaghan, and they are going down that route. And Reeves' budget was all about that. It was about attacking people who were seen as being rich. So you attack landowners, you attack pensioners, you go for a little bit of inheritance tax, you go for business because you don't understand that business. I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, but business has no money. Consumers and shareholders have money. They are individuals. You put burdens on business that affects individuals and shareholders, pensioners, all of us, rather than being disembodied business. And they don't understand that at all.
Yeah. Ultimately, you can only tax human beings. I mean, you can apply a tax on windows or farm animals, but it's not the windows and the farm animals that pay the tax.
Absolutely right.
It's the humans that pay the tax. One other area which Kyle Steely's raised a question on on Labour's record so far, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but he asks, Jacob, in your reality show, you spoke passionately about what you see as the benefits of boarding and the education you give your children. Could you share your thoughts about the recent Labour policy to apply VAT to fees, to school fees? And is this another area which I'm not necessarily wishing for this, but in a year or two's time, we might actually see that this has raised no money at all because the burden of parents moving their kids back into the comprehensive state sector, which has a cost, might more than offset, or at least largely offset, the VAT raked in by those who can afford it and keep their children in private school.
Oh, yes, I think that's extremely likely to happen. You see, politicians forget that we all live up to our marginal income. And if you put 20% on, then people go into deficit and their marginal income doesn't match it. And people will have to make hard decisions. And they look at schools like Eton and Harrow and think that the only people who go there are the sons of oligarchs. Well, that isn't true. That, yes, of course, there are some very rich people who send their children to Eton, but there are an awful lot of people for whom sending a child to Eton is a major chunk of, if not more than, their freely disposable income, and they're doing it out of capital. Add on 20%, that becomes impossible for some people. And so I think we see already that children are being taken out of the private system to go into the state system. I think it was purely an attack of class war. I don't think they care about whether it raises money or not. They care that it damages the private school system, which they want to abolish. You see, the private school system has humiliated the socialists for decades. When they abolished the grammar schools, if that had been it, no one would have known quite what the collapse in educational standards in this country was. But because we had a private sector, which is world-beating, where foreigners wish to send their children to our private sector, the failures of state education and of socialist educational theories has been absolutely clear. Mm-hmm. And for the socialists, this is infuriating. It's a humiliation. So they had to do something about it. They need to undermine private education without having the courage just to abolish it, which was, of course, policy up until the 1980s. There is one aside on this. It is, of course, a Brexit bonus that they could not apply VAT to school fees without Brexit. And as a strong advocate of Brexit, this is a good thing, that it shows that an elected government with a majority is able to make the law. And I knew when I campaigned for Brexit that not all laws that we were entitled to make, now we'd left the European Union, would be ones that I like. This one with 6 children to educate is one I particularly don't like, but it's proper and democratic that they are able to do it.
Yeah, enhanced freedom doesn't mean that you'll always use that freedom wisely.
Indeed.
We are on the clock, but I know Valerie Coker will kill me if I don't get her question in, which is the most upvoted, which goes a bit to the internal dynamics of the Conservative Party. In the book, The Plot, and the follow-up book by Nadine Dorries, allegations are made about named individuals in party HQ. The book correctly predicted the election of Rishi Sunak and his replacement as being Kemi Badenoch, which I find worrying, she said. Can you say if you're aware of the truth of any of this? And if so, what can be done to stop it? And I guess this would speak a bit to whether you, like myself, supported Robert Jenrick in the election. One of the reasons I did so is that it seemed to me that he was absolutely clear and unambiguous about completely overhauling the Conservative Party's machinery and resetting it and empowering local associations to decide who their candidates should be, within reason, of course, but not imposing on strong Conservative local associations a shortlist of one who happens to be the party chairman. Do you think the Conservative Party sort of machinery needs to be overhauled, changed in its structure, potentially its personnel, in order to make us match fit to win the next election, whether that's arm in arm with Nigel Farage or not?
Robert had asked me, had he won, to become the party chairman, and I think you can therefore be certain that he wanted a proper overhaul of central office, because I think this is essential, and that central office has been forcing candidates on associations who aren't particularly conservative. And it's very interesting how you have very strongly pro-European members of parliament in very Eurosceptic seats. I won't name names, it'd be invidious, but I expect people can work out for themselves what I mean. And that's a bad way of treating people. And you talk to people about the selection rounds and how all these people turn up at round after round after round because they're the people central office wants. And they send the same ones. They don't just give them one chance, they keep on sending them. And you have to ask yourself, why, if people have been rejected by several associations, does central office keep on sending them through as retreads? I think there are questions to be raised. I think fundamental reform is needed. I think authority needs to go back to the local associations. I fear local associations are a shadow of their former selves and may be hard to rebuild from such a low level. I like the challenge of taking it on, but I recognized it was a very difficult challenge to take on. And the candidates department at this point is fundamental, because if we're to win an election, we need nearly 250 new MPs. And therefore, central office can decide whether we are a Lib Dem party or a Conservative party. And until there's a proper reform, we can't be confident that it will be properly Conservative.
So let me just finish by asking you, Jacob, thanking you for your time, but with all of these challenges, but also with the horrors already inflicted upon us by this Labour government, so how confident are you on a scale of 0% to 100% that the Conservatives or some form of Conservative alliance will displace this government at the next general election and be able to carry out some of the changes that you and I would like to see? Is it a long shot? Is it a moonshot? Or is it comfortably within our grasp if we get the fundamentals right? Where are you on a 0 to 100% sort of guess of our prospects?
Well, there's the key caveat. You said if we get the fundamentals right. In 1997, I was confident that the Conservatives would come back, but I didn't know when. This time, I'm confident that Labour will lose, but I don't yet know who will win. It's very different to the Tony Blair experience. Tony Blair governed competently to start with. He inherited a very good economy and so on and so forth. Starmer has not started competently, and I just don't see how he can manage to present himself to voters. And he only started with 33% of the vote. There's never any enthusiasm for him. I think the next election is going to be very difficult for him, but we've got to get the fundamentals right. And this is very hard for Kemi, because there is an element that people aren't ready to hear from us, but an element where we've got to be saying things about important issues. And we've covered that in this discussion, but there is an inherent tension in that. She has a parliamentary party where a number of them, certainly quite a lot of them, didn't vote for her, but a number of them aren't particularly Conservative. One or two can't even tell you what the difference is between a man and a woman, which seems to be a pretty basic Conservative thought, to know the difference. So she's got a difficult parliamentary party. She's got a difficult balancing act. She's got Nigel, who is using publicity expertly and is not constrained. He is able to make the weather on migration, and he's beginning to make it on net zero, leaving us behind. So it is difficult. I obviously wish Kemi very well as she tackles all of this.
Well, you're not going to give me a number about how confident you're feeling?
I'm confident that Labour can't win the next election. I think they have cooked their goose already. Whether we can win outright or it's a coalition, I wouldn't be confident on that.
Jacob, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for your time. Sorry to overrun by a few minutes. Just before I thank Jacob, a couple of things for the audience in the chat. Firstly, sorry I couldn't get through all of your questions. We had, I think, nearly 50 of them, but I did try to pick those that were most relevant or those that have been most upvoted. Our next guest on Pop Conversations is Sir John Redwood. Former cabinet minister, of course, long-serving Conservative member of Parliament for Wokingham until he stood down at the last election. That's on Monday, the 16th of December at 7 p.m. If you go to the chat, you can find the link about how to sign up to join me in conversation with Sir John Redwood. And also, many of you will be already, but as you know, in order to try and get the view of Conservative grassroots members heard, PopCon runs an opinion panel. We survey those members of it about every couple of weeks on relevant topical issues. We certainly did that during the leadership election. We've recently had some fascinating views back from you on what we should make of and learn from the election of Donald Trump. If you're not yet a member of that panel, many hundreds of you are. We typically get about 500 or so responses each time. Again, you can join by finding the link in the webinar chat. And sign up. We'd love to hear your views. And it's not just to hear your views, we like to broadcast your views as well. So we get what you've said to Conservative MPs and as far as close to high command as we can. So thank you all for joining us for this lunchtime pop conversation. It's been great to have you all. I think we've had nearly 200 people have joined us at some point throughout this call. So thanks very much for your interest. More upcoming. Hope to see you again before Christmas. But Jacob, thank you so much for your time. Wonderful still to have you in public life. Vital still to have you in public life. More power at your elbow. And thank you so much for the food for thought, great analysis, and I think encouragement that you've given us all in the last hour. Greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mark.